To God be the glory.
Welcome back. I hope you have now read the book of Ruth twice. We're ready to start with verse 6 of chapter 1. Let's read verses 6 through 22. Then she arose, that's Naomi, with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, we'll return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it's exceedingly bitter for me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I'll go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, Is this Naomi? She said to them, Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. El Shaddai has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. In the previous session, we saw that a lot happened in the 10-plus years Naomi was in Moab. Imagine the range of emotions they experienced in that decade. She found food. Father and husband died. 2 sons got married. 2 sons died. Naomi went from having a family, friends, a home, and property in Bethlehem, happy days, to facing starvation and therefore leaving home, family, and friends and familiar customs, sad days, to finding food and setting up a new home, happy days, to losing her husband, sad days, to receiving 2 daughters-in-law. We'll call that happy days, but they were Moabite women, which is in direct defiance of God's law. So that should have made Naomi sad or at least disturbed, but we don't know. Then from there to losing both her sons, sad days for sure. Which means she also lost her only means of support and protection, desperate days. At that time, in those days, women couldn't inherit property, and they had no voice in court. Sons inherited and were expected to care for their mother. Women had to rely on a man in the family to look out for them. So at the end of these 10-plus years and the roller coaster of emotions, Naomi finds herself destitute. She and her daughters-in-law have lost everything. We might insert one more thing in this list of roller coaster emotions. What if she didn't want to leave Bethlehem in the first place? What if she wanted to stay in the land that God had promised and trust God to take care of them? But her husband said, "No, we're going where there's food right now." What do you think? Now, on top of everything, whether she said it out loud or not, she might be thinking, "I told him." If you were in Naomi's shoes, how would you be feeling right about now? Psychologists provide us with a list of traumas that can lead to clinical depression. Look at Naomi's list. It's full of death and loss. It's no wonder that in verse 13 of chapter 1, we see her using the word bitter to describe her situation. It is bitter. I'm not surprised this is her choice of words. But look also at Ruth. She had lost her father-in-law, a brother-in-law, and her husband, who died, and her sister-in-law, who decided to leave them and return home. She could have chosen bitterness, but she didn't. Think about your last decade. What kinds of things have you experienced? Are you like Naomi at a bitter place in your life? Are you wishing you could go back? In Genesis 12, Abram was called by God, told to go to Canaan, and promised a blessing if he would obey. After Abram arrived in Canaan, a famine came. Famine is a test of faith in God. It's like God saying, "Here's some trouble. Do you trust me to get you through it?" We have famines today. Food famines, emotional famines, job famines, COVID famine. Are you trusting God to see you through these famines? Abram left during his famine for Egypt, where there was food, rather than trusting God to provide for him. And after he'd been there for a short while, Pharaoh expelled him, and you can read those details in Genesis 12. And we see in Genesis 13, verses 3 and 4, that Abram went back to Bethel, where he had first built an altar for worshiping God. He stayed in Canaan, and eventually his grandson Jacob was born. Jacob experienced several tests of his faith, but eventually, guess what? There came a famine, and all the family wound up in Egypt. At the beginning of the famine, only some of the family went to Egypt to get food, which they brought back to the family. But eventually, the whole family of father and 11 sons and their families went to Egypt. They should have left Egypt and gone back to the Promised Land after they got some food. But 400 years later, the whole nation was still there. Do you remember what it took to get them to want to go back to Canaan? It took slavery, harsh taskmasters. It took their babies being taken from their arms and killed. As a group of people, they had to learn all over again what it means to trust the almighty, sufficient provider, El Shaddai. They had to go back. Sometimes we need to go back in order to be restored to fellowship with God. Isaiah 55, verse 7 says, "Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon." But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, in verse 6 of chapter 1, we see that Naomi learns the famine in Bethlehem has ended, and she's in the wrong place. When we're in trouble and alone, we want to go home. I do. Do you? Naomi heads toward Bethlehem, but there's no indication that she's returning to a right relationship with God. There's still no indication that she is talking to God about what He would have her do. She's behaving as if she has to take care of everything, as if it's all up to her. Here's the story of 3 widows, 3 destitute widows, 3 widows with nothing and no one to protect them from the world. 3 destitute widows with no one to protect them, and they're without God. Naomi is in the wrong place to receive God's blessing. And once again, her decision is not based on what God wants, but based on her physical need. In verses 8 and 9, we do finally see God's name mentioned by Naomi. She talks like a child of God. May the Lord deal kindly with you. May the Lord grant that you may find rest. These words sound good. What do you talk about with your daughters-in-law? Recipes, clothes, work? How about God? Do you talk with your daughters-in-law about spiritual matters? Do you encourage their faith? Do you nurture it? Naomi speaks a blessing on her daughters-in-law and tells them to stay in their own culture, find husbands, have a family. This might seem selfless, kind, caring, but it's not really, not in my opinion. Naomi is sending them back to idolatry. I question her thinking. Why isn't she thinking more like Moses did when he invited his brother-in-law to come with him and the Israelites to the promised land? Moses told Hobab in Numbers 10, verse 29, "Come with us, we will do you good." Why doesn't Naomi invite her daughters-in-law to come with her? Warren Wiersbe, in his study of Ruth, says that Naomi didn't want the young women to come with her because they would be evidence to her family and friends in Bethlehem that Mahlon and Chilion had broken God's law by marrying Moabite women. I don't know about that, but I do know that I'm headed to heaven's promised land, and I want people to go with me, especially my family. I don't want to send them away from God. How about you? At this point, Ruth and Orpah are pretty much equal. They've faced the same losses, and now they face the same choice. Ruth's choice brings her into God's people. Orpah's choice means she will remain with worshipers of false gods. Listen, ladies, God is available to all people everywhere. But each person must make a deliberate, rational choice to be with Him. Each one gets to choose whether to stay away from God or go toward God. Verse 9 of chapter 1 says that the 3 women wept. Women cry. What kind of tears do you think they were? What kind of things make a woman cry? Beautiful things, sad things. Sometimes anger will make a woman cry. Disappointment, despair, frustration, anxiety, surprise, all of those things. Maybe you can think of some other things. What do you think brought on these tears among Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah? Surprise, perhaps. Here they are on the road toward Bethlehem, and Naomi suddenly tells the girls to go back home. Perhaps they're saddened to be suddenly faced with life without each other. Maybe they're tears of anxiety about what they will do now. How will they start over with nothing, not even each other, when they have shared life together for a decade? Whatever the reason for the tears, Ruth and Orpah's words and their tears express a kinship with Naomi. What do you think about verse 11? But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands?" This is kind of confusing, isn't it? Can you imagine? What if your mother-in-law said to you, "I'm too old to bear another son to become your husband"? Would you say, "What in the world are you talking about"? Do you know what Naomi means by this? Well, she's talking about the levirate marriage, which we can read about in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 and 6. In Deuteronomy, this passage, we read that God directed the people of Israel, if brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in to her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. This was one of God's laws given to the Israelites just before they entered the Promised Land. This is a law given to the Israelites. This is not a law accepted universally. This was not a law in Moab. And yet Naomi says, "Go home, girls. I'm too old to give you other husbands." And there's no explanation of what she means. There's no record of the girls saying, "What are you talking about?" or asking her what she means. I'd like to think that Ruth and Orpah understood what she meant. Does this indicate to you, as it does to me, that this Jewish family, Naomi, Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, taught these two Gentile girls about Jehovah and his laws? Verse 13 is our first glimpse of Naomi's bitterness. We've already considered Naomi's many losses and how that can affect anyone's mental attitude. We're not surprised that she's sad, bitter, depressed. Do her words in verse 13 sound at all familiar to you? It is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Do you know anyone who has made a decision without considering whether the choice will bring them closer to God or take them further away from Him, and then, when things go badly, blame it on God? Verse 14, they lifted up their voices and wept again. These may be a different kind of tear from those in verse 9. Orpah is torn. She doesn't want to separate from Ruth and Naomi, but you can imagine she might be thinking, it's just more sensible to go home to Mama. My parents will take care of me. With Naomi, I have nothing. With Naomi, my future looks bleak. Orpah chose to go back, and Ruth insists on going forward with Naomi. In a time and place of faithlessness, there is Ruth choosing faithfulness. No matter how evil the world gets, there will always be a faithful remnant. I pray you are that faithful remnant. And it's Ruth that affirms her commitment. And it's clear there's more to her decision than loving Naomi. Faith in God is what makes the difference. Both girls heard about God. One chose Him, one did not. Both choices were respected. No one is compelled to believe and trust in God. Verses 16 and 17 is why there's a book of Ruth in the Bible. Ruth loves Naomi, but more importantly, she chooses, think about it, Ruth chooses to give up her family, her people, her culture, the false gods of her culture, her language. She no longer identifies with Moab. Ruth has embraced Judaism. It's more than a set of laws to her. It's a commitment. She's a true believer, and she tells Naomi, "Your God is my God, and only death will separate us." Ruth is telling Naomi, "I know where you're going. I know how difficult it will be. But no matter what, I'm going there too." In verse 18, we see that Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, so she said no more. What? No, "Oh, God bless you, my child." No, "Oh, thank you, I love you too." Just, the verse says, she said no more. There's going to be a problem with Ruth's decision when they get to Bethlehem. Can you see it coming? God told His people that no Moabite shall enter the congregation. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3. Can you see there's going to be a problem? And we'll see how that goes later in the book. What we will see is that God can and will use anyone to accomplish his purpose. He can and will use even those who are of the lowest standing. We're going to see him use a poor, foreign woman. No matter your standing in this world, God wants to use you to accomplish his purpose. Verse 19, they went on until they came to Bethlehem. That statement leaves out a lot. Moab to Bethlehem is at least 50 miles. 2 women alone, no one to protect them. This is a dangerous trek. So picture the map. Moab is on the southeast side of the Dead Sea, while Bethlehem is at the north end of and on the west side of the Dead Sea. And no matter which direction they traveled, they had to walk through some mountains. Verse 18 says that Naomi said no more. Do you think she said nothing on the trip? They're women. Of course they talked. It just means that Naomi no longer tried to dissuade Ruth from going with her. But what do you think they talked about as they walked this 50 miles? What it's like in Canaan? What Bethlehem is like? What it's like to be an Israelite? Did they walk side by side, each one alone with her thoughts? 50 miles through mountainous terrain. With every step, they get more and more exhausted and perhaps hungry. This trip would have taken a week or more. Did they pack enough food for the trip? Did they have to hunt for food along the way? When you're tired and hungry, what happens to your attitude? What do you think might have happened to Naomi's and Ruth's attitude? And how do you think they might have looked when they arrived in Bethlehem? Verse 19 says the people of the town were stirred. That means the town was buzzing. Can't you just hear the women whispering, "Is this Naomi?" Talking to each other. That happens, doesn't it? Instead of talking to someone, we talk about someone. But evidently, they weren't sure it was Naomi. Traumatic life changes affect our mental state. Our mental state affects how we look. Naomi hears them whispering about her and confronts them. Don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. I'm not pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. We know when we have a bad attitude, don't we? The first time God is called El Shaddai is in Genesis 17, verse 1. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord, Jehovah, appeared and said to him, I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Remember I said Abram was 99 years old when God said this to him? With no children. But God is promising him descendants more numerous than there are stars, more numerous than there are grains of sand. El Shaddai means the Almighty, all-sufficient God, the bountiful giver. It's the work of El Shaddai to nourish life. When the bodies of Abram and Sarah are past the ability to produce children, El Shaddai tells Abram, I am the strong and powerful, bountiful giver. I am sufficient to make this happen. I have promised it, and it will come to pass if you walk before me and be blameless. And guess what? El Shaddai kept his promise. 1 year later, Abraham and Sarah have a son, Isaac, who has a son named Jacob, who has 12 sons who become the tribes of Israel. Here we have Naomi using the name El Shaddai, but I don't see evidence that she believes he is the all-powerful, bountiful giver. His hand has gone out against me, she says, because what she says is, I went away full, and the bountiful giver has brought me back with nothing but the clothes on my back. I read those words, and I feel lightning crackle. I don't think God likes sarcasm. Naomi knows his name, and she knows about his laws. But it seems to me that to Naomi, Judaism is a way to live, a culture, not a faith. Trusting obedience is not seen in her behavior or her conversation. Ladies, we get bitter when we're out of fellowship with God. But God still cares for us, even when we're bitter. We're going to see the proof of that as we read further in the book. So much has happened in chapter 1. Sorrow, joy, sorrow. God didn't cause the series of calamities, but He used them to bring about something wonderful. The chapter starts with sorrow, but it ends with hope. They have arrived at the beginning of barley harvest, which is why the book is traditionally read at Pentecost. How fortuitous. I mean, really, what a coincidence. We'll see why in chapter 2. If you feel like Naomi, though, a little angry at God, if life seems hopeless, don't worry. God can handle that. He handled Naomi's bitter attitude, and He can handle your attitude, whatever it is. We can express our feelings to Him. We can even find it impossible to talk to Him. Here's the hope. Naomi doesn't know what's in her future. We know. In the rest of the book, we see that our bitterness and anger doesn't change God. He goes right on working for us, doing what is in our best interest. God is working even when we can't see it, just as He did for Naomi and Ruth. But we have to make a choice, just as they did. Trust God or go away from God. Ruth chose to give up everything to follow Jehovah. She sees that El Shaddai is the only real hope for life. Jesus calls us to follow Him. Will you declare, as Ruth did, that God is your God, that you will trust and obey Him, that you will submit to Him, and that nothing will separate you from Him? Please join me in the next video for chapter 2 of the book of Ruth.